Now we begin in the United States, where George Floyd's brother has told politicians to make sure his death was not in vain. Philonise Floyd testified at a hearing on Capitol Hill today. His brother's death in police custody sparked 2 weeks of protests across the US and around the world. The House Judiciary Committee says it's answering protesters' calls for a fundamental change in the culture of law enforcement.
I'm here to ask you to make it stop. Stop the pain. Stop us from being tired. George called for help and he was ignored. Please listen to the call I'm making to you now, to the calls of our family and the calls ringing out the streets across the world. People of all backgrounds, genders, and races have come together to demand change. Honor them, honor George, and make the necessary changes that make law enforcement the solution.
Heidi Jo Castro is our correspondent, tracking that conversation for us out of the Capitol building there on Capitol Hill. So, Heidi, certain guidelines, they've already been scrapped, they've been got rid of, but what do we know about what will come after that?
That's right. On the local level, there has been some talk of reforms, but there has yet to be a nationwide police reform. And it's what's being demanded by this moment, where hundreds of thousands of Americans have taken to the street in these past 2 weeks demanding reform. And we've seen Democrats present a reform package, and there's some movement from Republicans as well as to address this death of George Floyd and the systemic racism that it has exposed in this country. What we're seeing today before this committee hearing by the House Judiciary Committee are 12 witnesses, including, of course, the brother of George Floyd, who in his powerful testimony spoke of the pain he felt watching his brother die beneath the knee of that white police officer in Minneapolis. But we're also seeing Republicans, in a sense, have a showdown of narratives with Democrats. They inviting their own Republican witness, a woman by the name of Angela Underwood Jacobs, who's African-American and lost her brother, who was a federal police officer. He was gunned down in the line of duty. Now, you're also seeing a competition here as far as the terminology we've heard shouted by these protesters of defund the police. What does that actually mean? The nuance there being exploited, in a sense, by these political parties. Republicans saying that defunding the police, the equivalent of abolishing the police, which has only been asked for by the far left, calling that idea ludicrous, but attempting to paint the entire Democratic Party with that same brush. Meanwhile, the actual legislation that is pending here in the House of Representatives and introduced by Democrats does not seek to defund or abolish any police departments. Rather, it would create a national database to track police misconduct. It would ban chokeholds, similar to what resulted in the death of George Floyd and many other Black Americans. And it would also seek to remove the no-knock warrants in some cases and make it easier to sue police officers in both criminal proceedings and civil proceedings. Now, the White House has already said that stripping some of this immunity from police officers is a non-starter in this legislation. And although it is likely to pass here in the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, it is unlikely to have much traction in the Republican-controlled Senate. Peter.
As far as the Republican contingent on the committee is concerned, Heidi, do they have any ideas to bring the country together, particularly given, 6 months from now, you and I will be having a conversation about the presidential election? It seems to me at this distance that the Republicans are being accused of being divisive instead of productive, instead of trying to be an emollient, a healing influence there.
Absolutely, and particularly over on the Senate side, Republicans there having an increasing worry that this may cost them the Republican majority in the Senate come the November elections. 7 in 10 Americans in recent polling have said that George Floyd's death is emblematic of a greater systemic problem. Similar majorities of Americans saying that racial discrimination is a big issue in this country. Now, that's come a long ways over the last last 5 years, when the number of Americans who agreed to that was only about 40%, about 6 years ago. So certainly there is a movement happening on the streets of America, and Congress is reacting to that, with Republicans cognizant that some reform is likely necessary. And at the end of this week, we're expecting for Republicans to have their own answers for their proposals to reform policing in America. We know that the one element that likely will not be included in the Republican version of reforms would be stripping this immunity from police officers. President Trump saying on Twitter that that is a non-starter.
Okay, Heidi, thanks very much. We'll talk to you later. Vincent Warren is a civil rights attorney. He says the issue of police brutality does require a long-term systemic change.
What we're seeing is that folks are rallying to the support of Black people, listening to Black people's experience and saying this has to stop. That is a massive, massive force. And the only thing that the president has going for him is his base, which is relatively small but powerful in the United States, and the narrative that if we don't continue to invest in police departments, Black people are going to kill white people. That's essentially what the discussion is. And it's never subtle with him, although he's being a little bit more subtle now than usual. But I think at the end of the day, what people are beginning to realize is that the only reason why law enforcement exists to this day, to the extent that it does, is to the extent that people can continue to convey a narrative of criminality amongst Black people. So the idea that someone like George Floyd, everybody in Congress is going to say that was a horrible thing, but nobody in Congress is going to say that that is endemic and systemic and has been happening for many, many years on and off video. And that becomes a problem that we have to resolve systemically and not just with policy reforms.